So overall, we will have a naval advantage, at least in the beginning, with, like I said, better captains. We have better ships, even though they're smaller. They are going to be better built. The most famous of these ships is the USS Constitution. This series of ships was called Old Ironsides. It was made of such hard oak that cannonballs could actually bounce off of it. The Constitution won several victories, and other ships did well also. There were about 16 single ship-to-ship engagements in the War of 1812, and we won 14 out of 16 of those. It was so bad that the British actually made fun of themselves, which is a lot for the British to do. The King of England, by the way, was still King George III. He was out of his mind by that time. He suffered from very bad dementia and it was actually very embarrassing to Britain. But around this time, they got smart and they started putting their ships into squadrons, and then the Americans started losing. Um, the British were so engaged in fighting Napoleon that they weren't thinking much about us right now at all. The main thing, though, is we still are going to have mostly disadvantages. We do not have enough men. Like I was saying, this is going to be mostly done by the militia. We do not have enough money, period. And other than the some Navy captains, we really did not have any strong leaders. The first generation were all mostly gone by this time, the first generation of leaders who had won the American Revolution. And now we have a new crop. We were really naive when we went into this. We were poorly funded, but we thought we could do it. And so now we find ourselves then at war. So we're going to be a little bit lucky the first 2 years because England was so busy. They're not going to get serious until the fighting again stops with Napoleon, and then the British then will turn their attentions back to us. And in 1814 they're going to devise a plan to basically cut the United States into pieces. They were going to launch a three-prong invasion of the United States. They were going to try to isolate New England. Then they were going to try to come up this way through the Chesapeake and isolate this portion, and then they were also going to go up through the port of New Orleans, and that is not on the map, but we're going to get to that. So the first prong, so we're going to stop this first prong here when the British are going to be defeated in the Battle of Lake Champlain. We actually built a fleet of ships up there, and we defeated them. And then the British Army couldn't move their supplies, so that was a win. The second invasion, though, went better for the British. They landed in Maryland with about 2,000 men, and we are going to meet up and meet them with about 6,000 militiamen. Now that sounds like that would be a good thing, except that was again the King's own regular army. And so here we have, they're coming up the Chesapeake, and they're going to meet here at Bladensburg. And we are going to see the British, and we are going to run. We are going to run away. The legend had it that we ran so fast that they called it the Bladensburg races. So after this, then, after they captured Bladensburg, the British are going to march into D.C. They're going to narrowly miss capturing Madison, and they are going to burn down the White House. Then, so here we have the reenactment of the burning of DC. This is where Dolly Madison gets her claim, one of her big claims to fame. She did not evacuate with the rest. She stayed and she was able to gather a bunch of tremendously important papers and a painting of George Washington, and she orchestrated the evacuation of the White House. It was really, really quite heroic. Dolly Madison is also notable because she's going to really set the precedent of what first ladies are going to be like and what the expectation was of first ladies. She isn't going to hang back. She's going to make the role of the first lady to host parties, host gatherings at the White House, make it a center of both domestic and foreign affairs, that you would come and that she would be the first lady would be the hostess, but it was with a very specific purpose. So she does really define the role of first lady. So after they burned the White House, the British are going to go on to attack Baltimore. Fortunately, there was a defense system there. They managed to defend it, and then they are going to make their way to, it was Fort McHenry. So Fort McHenry is going to also be defended well, and the British are going to be forced to withdraw. And it is actually from this Battle of Fort McHenry that Francis Scott Key wrote the national anthem. He wrote it as a poem, and the tune is actually set to an Old English drinking song. Now, most countries have really nice anthems. Ours is kind of a weirdo song about an episode from a disastrous war and set to a tune that nobody can actually sing. Another fun fact is that F. Scott Fitzgerald was a descendant of Francis Scott Key. So, after this Battle of Fort McHenry, we more or less had stopped the British. Things are going to be simultaneously worse and better. We had actually already begun peace negotiations with England, and we're going to have these peace negotiations beginning in Ghent, in Belgium. We sent over 5 capable diplomats, notably John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, and he's going to be accompanied by Henry Clay. Remember, Henry Clay was one of the war hawks. He was from Kentucky. We're going to be hearing a lot about Henry Clay. Adams was a bit uptight. He was very much an early to bed, early to rise kind of fellow, but Clay was a party boy from Kentucky. They didn't really get along. The British were actually going to be really confused during the negotiations. They never knew exactly who to listen to. But regardless, they will sign the Treaty of Ghent on December 24th, 1814, so on Christmas Eve. It was really a perfect ending to the year. And it said, we won't fight anymore. It was not a very good treaty at all. It was actually a very murky treaty that accomplished nothing and set us back. It just said, we go back to pre-war conditions. Well, that doesn't actually say much, but it is over. There is another problem, though, that nobody back in the United States knew that the war was actually over. It takes about 2 months to get word back to the United States that the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, and Madison's situation is going to get worse. In December of 1814, so before the Treaty of Ghent is signed, the Federalists decided they were thinking about seceding from the United States. They basically were ready to cause trouble. This is it's called the Hartford Convention. The Federalists met in Hartford, Connecticut, this meeting of New England Federalists, and they made a list of demands to James Madison and the government. They basically say, you do what we want or we walk. This really emphasizes how fragile the Union was. Remember, they were very unhappy with the War of 1812. These were the merchants. These are the ones who hadn't wanted to go to war in the first place. They are the ones who are going to feel the economic impact the most. So by January 1st, 1815, James Madison things aren't looking very good for James Madison. The word of the peace treaty is coming. You have the delegates from Hartford that are on their way. And also there's going to be a huge attack on Louisiana, and Madison is going to have to deal with New Orleans. So in January of 1815, the British had begun advancing towards the city of New Orleans, and on January 8th, they are going to fight the Battle of New Orleans. It was actually fought very early in the morning. It was very foggy that day, and the advantage is going to go to the United States. We were actually going to be fighting from a defensive position. We had some troops there. We also had some militia and a few free blacks. The commander is going to be General Andrew Jackson. We actually were using the terrain to our advantage and hiding behind cotton bales. About 2,000 British were killed or wounded to about 50 to 100 U.S. Jackson's victory in New Orleans is going to be absolutely critical. Some people have called it a needless battle, but the reality is it wasn't. Because if the English had won, they would have taken the port of New Orleans. Then the War of 1812 would not have been over. So January 8th of 1815 becomes actually a very important day in history, and I'll say January 8th in general is an important day because it was also Elvis's birthday. So Jackson is going to become a huge national hero. He is going to become really the greatest hero known in the country, and he's so widely known that when he dies in the 1840s, people will say the hero is dead. So Madison, however, is still waiting for news. And the first news to reach him are actually the Federalists from the Hartford Convention. Fortunately, then shortly after word arrives that we'd had a victory in New Orleans, and then, oh hey, there is a peace treaty here for Congress to ratify. So it was really over, because they do ratify then the Treaty of Ghent. The immediate result of the War of 1812 is going to be the end of the Federalist Party. They looked really bad after this. They looked, well, first off, they had the losing position, and they seemed like really unpatriotic crybabies, considering that the war had ended in our favor. The Federalists basically they were dinosaurs. They were not ready to evolve any further, and so they weren't willing to evolve their platform. They are going to die out. The big picture here, this whole thing was a really close call, and we could have lost the entire country. The Americans claim that we won. That's a really interesting way to put it. I would just say we did not lose. In Canada, actually, they like to say they almost conquered America. That's also true. But we were very, very lucky. This ends up being a great amount of psychological vindication. We did not lose it all. And this is going to cause a tremendous surge in American nationalism. And we started feeling pretty full of ourselves. We started feeling like we could stand up for ourselves and stand up for our rights on a world stage. And we're going to see this manifested culturally. we're going to see the emergence of great American literature. It wasn't until this time that we actually started getting decent books to read, and representations of a more unified culture. One of the great novels of this period was Pride and Prejudice, yes, English, and at this time, Americans were basically trying to copy Pride and Prejudice, but make it set in America. It really stunk. But now we're going to have other things like Last of the Mohicans by Fenimore Cooper. We're going to have stories by Washington Irving and your favorite Nathaniel Hawthorne. The Scarlet Letter is going to come a little bit later, but he will start writing at this time. So like I said, we'll see the rise then of our war hero, Andrew Jackson, also William Henry Harrison. He will also be president, a very short-lived president. Too soon to laugh about that. We'll get there. Surge of Canadian nationalism. I put a little picture there of Justin Bieber for you. And also, we're going to now have an increase in United States manufacturing. We realized that we had to get on top of it when it came to manufacturing. We hadn't been industrialized during the American Revolution. We needed to have had a larger manufacturing capacity for fighting the War of 1812 that we really did not have. And so now we're going to say, wow, we don't want that to happen again. We better start being more self-sufficient. And like I said, we feel good about ourselves and we see ourselves as a big player on the world stage. So we'll end there for today. Next class, stay tuned. I have some banjo music for you, and you can take the remainder of the period to either do your reading, because you guys definitely have some reading, or you can work on your proposition paragraphs. And bring me any questions next class.